It was a sunny afternoon at the Grand Regional Conference Center, an event organized to celebrate West African cooperation and youth leadership. Government officials, foreign delegates, and journalists filled the sparkling white hall, dressed in crisp suits and shining shoes. The energy buzzed with power and self-importance, but no one noticed the man at the back. He walked in quietly, wearing simple sandals and a faded shirt, modest, respectful, and calm. He didn't carry a name tag or security entourage. Instead, he looked like someone who had wandered in from the street. A volunteer approached him. Her smile disappeared the moment she looked him up and down. "Sir, this event is not open to the public," she said sharply, blocking his path. Several people glanced over and giggled. He gave a polite nod and quietly stepped aside. But he didn't leave. Instead, he stood in silence, watching the speakers take the stage, one of them speaking proudly of Burkina Faso's bright future under strong leadership. No one knew that the man they had just insulted was Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso, and the storm was just beginning. As more dignitaries filed in, the man remained standing near the entrance. The hall was nearly full. Ushers walked by him without a second glance. A few whispered, others sneered. One junior official, wearing an oversized badge and borrowed confidence, leaned toward a colleague and said, "How did a barefoot villager get in here?" The colleague laughed. Cameras flashed nearby, but none pointed toward the man. He didn't flinch. He stood still, folding his arms lightly, eyes steady, not with anger, but with something deeper, as if he was watching a performance he'd seen before. Then an older journalist who had flown in from Ouagadougou stopped suddenly. She squinted. Her pen fell from her hand. "No, that can't be," she whispered. Her intern leaned over. "What is it, madam?" She didn't answer. Instead, she rushed toward the back of the hall. The crowd continued to chuckle. But the journalist's steps were swift, intentional. Meanwhile, the MC on stage praised world leaders for showing humility. The irony echoed like thunder. And just as the man adjusted his sleeves, something was about to happen that would flip the entire room upside down. The journalist reached the man and gently touched his shoulder. "Captain?" she asked, almost breathless. He looked at her and nodded once. She covered her mouth in shock. Then she turned and shouted the words that stopped the entire room. "That's the president of Burkina Faso." Gasps. Silence. Then murmurs grew like a rising tide. The same usher who told him to leave dropped her tablet. The junior official who had mocked him stood frozen, his face pale. The MC fumbled his notes. Security guards rushed forward, but not to remove him. This time, they formed a protective wall around him. The man who had been insulted, ignored, and humiliated simply walked forward, slowly toward the stage, with the quiet authority of a lion among sheep. The crowd parted like water. Phones came out. Cameras flashed. Live streams launched. The story had taken a turn the world would not forget. The room that once laughed now stood in shameful silence. And what President Traoré would say next would shake every soul watching, both in the hall and online. The moment the truth hit the room, "He is the president," people began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Some stood. Others looked for a place to hide their shame. The woman who had blocked him earlier tried to step forward and speak. "Mr. President, I didn't know—" But her voice was swallowed by silence. Captain Traoré raised his hand gently. "It's okay," he said softly. "You treated me like how most people are treated when they don't wear titles." Then he looked around the room, his eyes scanning faces that had just seconds ago looked down on him. "This is not about me," he added. "This is about us, about how we've forgotten what respect looks like, especially for those who look poor or walk in without a suit." No one clapped, because no one dared to. Instead, heads dropped. Tears welled up in the eyes of some elderly attendees in the back row. One man whispered, "We failed this test." And still, President Traoré stood calm, with no anger in his voice. Only quiet truth. What happened next would leave even the cameras shaking. As the organizers scrambled to rearrange the program, someone pointed to the front row, the reserved section with signs marked for dignitaries only. One of the men in a tailored Italian suit jumped up and offered his seat. But President Traoré shook his head. "I will sit where I was told to stand." Gasps echoed again. Then he did the unthinkable. He returned to the corner near the door, the very spot where he was first turned away. He sat on a plastic chair. No cushion, no spotlight. Silence fell again. One brave young woman, a student delegate, stood up and walked toward him. She sat down beside him on the floor, then another, and another. Within 2 minutes, the entire front row was empty. Delegates, press, even a regional minister walked away from their VIP seats and joined Traoré near the wall. The cameras couldn't catch it all at once. It wasn't planned. It was honest. And for the first time that afternoon, the gathering no longer felt formal. It felt real. The president hadn't just exposed their pride. He'd inspired their change. But the day wasn't over. A journalist live streaming the event whispered to her mic, "We are witnessing something historic." One of the cameramen, shaking, turned to film the front row, now completely abandoned. Every seat that once represented power and status now sat empty. Across social media, the clip was already spreading. President in disguise began trending within the hour, but inside the hall something else was happening. President Traoré was handed a microphone. The MC, voice trembling, asked if he would like to give the keynote. He stood, took the mic, and said, "No. The most powerful message today was your silence." Gasps. Again. Then he looked toward the exit. "There are people outside this room who look just like I did when I walked in. Please, treat them better than you treated me." With that, he placed the mic on the chair, turned, and began walking toward the exit. The entire audience stood to their feet. Applause erupted, not from obligation, but from shame, awe, and admiration. And just before he walked out, the cameras caught one final image, President Traoré holding the door open for an elderly janitor. That image would shake the world. By now the footage had already gone viral outside, but inside the hall, no one moved without first glancing at President Traoré. He stood at the exit, shaking hands, not with officials, but with janitors, servers, and the volunteers who had been treated like ghosts all day. One older diplomat, once seated comfortably in the front, quietly slipped out a side door. He had called Traoré a lost farmer earlier. Another man, head of a local NGO, pulled his business card from the president's path, afraid he'd be remembered. The event that was meant to show off power had become something else, a mirror, and many didn't like what they saw. Still, President Traoré remained calm. No guards, no arrogance, no anger, just grace. And that grace stirred something deeper. In that moment, people didn't just see a president. They saw a leader. She was the same woman who mocked Traoré when he arrived. She had said, "This isn't a village meeting." Now she stood in the corner with tears rolling down her cheeks. As the president passed, he paused and looked at her. "I didn't recognize you," she whispered. Traoré nodded. "I know, but I recognized you, and that's why I stayed." That one sentence made the room tremble. The cameras zoomed in, and in a blink, the image made it online. The caption read, "Humility wears no badge." Minutes later, international news channels picked up the feed. Major African and European outlets began airing clips, but inside that small hall, there were no breaking news graphics. Just breaking pride. The president had every right to scold or embarrass. Instead, he chose to teach. And for the first time in a long while, the crowd didn't feel like strangers to each other. They felt like students. When the president finally sat again, it wasn't at the front, or even at the side. It was at the very back of the room, beside an elderly man no one had spoken to all day. The man was blind in one eye and had been ignored by almost everyone. Traoré sat down next to him and leaned in. They spoke quietly for a few minutes. Then the man stood and said aloud, "This man didn't come to be worshipped. He came to see who we really are." That sentence hit harder than the president's title. It echoed. One by one, attendees turned in their chairs. The focus was no longer the program, it was the message. Not one about power, but about dignity. A man came dressed like a nobody and left every soul in that hall exposed, naked in their judgment. And yet, no one was punished. Instead, they were forgiven, and now the world couldn't stop watching. Back at the podium, the organizers fumbled with the schedule. The keynote speaker, originally a foreign investor, had left quietly. Others on the panel were too shaken to continue. All eyes remained on the back of the room. An aide leaned toward the MC. "Ask him again to speak." The MC nodded, stood up nervously, and said into the mic, "Mr. President, we would be honored if you gave us a few words." The room turned to see Traoré's response, but he simply shook his head. He didn't need a stage. He had already said more with silence, patience, and dignity than any microphone could amplify. "No speech," he said gently. "Just reflection." The crowd remained seated, but online the world was now standing still. Clips from different angles flooded social media. Headlines popped up globally. Africa's youngest president humbles a nation in silence. Captain Traoré breaks every rule and teaches every heart. Inside that room, something had broken, and it wasn't the program, it was ego. Just before leaving, Traoré passed by a table where a young volunteer sat crying. She was the first to mock his appearance. Now, she couldn't look him in the eye. He stopped, then bent down and said softly, "It's how you treat the nobodies that defines who you are." She nodded through tears. Unaware, a journalist nearby captured the moment on video. That whisper, just 5 seconds long, would soon become one of the most shared clips in Burkina Faso's media history. It was picked up by TV networks, stitched into TikToks, echoed in sermons, and quoted in boardrooms. Politicians scrambled to issue statements of praise, but none of that mattered inside the hall. Because by now, the atmosphere had completely changed. No one remembered the official agenda. They remembered the feeling: regret, then respect, then renewal. All from a man who came in unnoticed and left with the room's deepest attention. And just when everyone thought the moment had peaked, the janitor stood up. He was thin, gray-haired, and wore a faded uniform with a missing button. No one had spoken to him all day. He had quietly swept the corners of the room while executives took selfies and shook hands. Now he stood up, holding his mop like a cane. With a soft voice, he said, "I saw how you treated him. I've worked here for 22 years. I've watched many walk in rich and walk out empty." The room was silent. He turned to Traoré and added, "You were the first to greet me with 2 hands. You remembered I was human." Cameras zoomed in, eyes filled with tears. And once again, the lesson of the day deepened. Dignity wasn't in suits, or podiums, or titles. It was in how one sees others. That janitor's words would become the final blow to pride in that room. And as he sat down, President Traoré gave him a small nod, one of respect. The kind only a real leader can give. With the official program in ruins, the audience sat in stillness. No one dared to resume the original schedule. The once highly guarded front row, those VIP-only seats, remained untouched like cursed symbols of pride. One chair in particular had a golden label on the back, Chairman, International Guests. But the guest had left earlier, red-faced before the truth was exposed. Now that chair stood empty, a silent witness to arrogance. A young man, one of the attendees from a rural youth cooperative, stood up and approached it. Everyone watched. Instead of sitting, he removed the golden label. "I think we've had enough of this today," he said. Murmurs of agreement filled the room. Another person stood up and tore off the director's label. Then another removed senior delegate from her seat. Suddenly, all the chairs looked the same. Equal. That image, recorded by a nearby cameraman, was broadcast worldwide within hours. Burkina Faso Conference destroys the meaning of status, led by President himself. One scene, one chair, one quiet revolution, and yet the most powerful moment was still ahead. As President Traoré prepared to leave the gathering hall, a boy about 10 years old peeked in from a narrow hallway. His school uniform was dusty. He had come with his mother, a cleaner who worked at the venue. When he saw the cameras and the crowd, he turned to run. But Traoré called out softly, "Young man, don't be afraid." The boy stopped. Slowly, he walked forward and stood before the president. Everyone watched. Traoré knelt down to meet him eye to eye. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" he asked. The boy whispered, "I want to be like you." There was no applause, just stillness. Traoré responded, "Then remember, respect is not about who notices you. It's about how you treat those no one notices." The boy smiled. And in that moment, the world saw the real victory. It wasn't just about how a president handled shame. It was about how a generation would learn from it. And for the cameras watching, That moment became the most replayed clip of the entire event. One boy, one sentence, one tear-filled silence. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré finally stepped out of the room, the entire audience stood, not out of duty, but out of deep respect. There was no national anthem, no military escort, no applause, only stillness. As he walked toward the exit, attendees followed quietly, one by one, forming a human path behind him. The same people who had once laughed, whispered, and judged now walked like students behind a teacher. He turned once at the door, looked back at the hall, no longer divided by rank, and gave a small wave. No words, just presence. Outside the venue, hundreds had already gathered. News crews, curious citizens, bystanders who had seen the live stream. They didn't cheer. They placed their hands over their hearts. And then, for the first time that day, someone began to clap. A slow, sincere applause. Not for power, but for humility. And soon, the entire crowd joined in. It echoed down the street. A leader had come in unnoticed. He left as the most recognized man in the room. Just as President Traoré stepped outside the gathering hall, one final moment happened, unexpected and unscripted. An elderly woman, barefoot and carrying a basket of fruit, approached the crowd. She didn't know who he was. She simply asked, "Why is everyone standing so still?" When she saw the cameras and the flags, she stepped back, embarrassed. But President Traoré noticed her. He walked up to her, took one mango from the basket, and handed her a small folded note. Then he bowed, not as a politician, but as a man raised with values. One of the journalists snapped the photo. That photo, within minutes, was shared across the continent. The caption read, "He didn't just humble a room, he honored a stranger." In a world where politicians often seek power through noise, Traoré had done it through stillness. And people everywhere noticed. Even critics began to rethink their words. Opponents grew quiet. For a rare moment, the world wasn't divided by opinions, but united by admiration. The fallout from the event was immediate and global. Talk shows in Europe, Africa, and the US replayed the footage with mixed emotions. Some called it a masterclass in humility. Others accused organizers of classism and shameful gatekeeping. In Burkina Faso, public opinion turned sharply against those who had mocked the president. Several officials at the event issued tearful public apologies. One resigned, but Traoré, he refused to fuel the flames. "No one should be judged forever by one mistake," he said in a brief radio interview, "but we must all learn from it." Still, the question on everyone's mind was simple. Why did he do it? Why show up unannounced? Why wear plain clothes? Why refuse the spotlight? One advisor, speaking anonymously, said, "He wanted to see how people would act when they didn't know they were being watched, and they failed that test, until he gave them another chance." At sunset, the formal gathering quietly closed. No press release, no post-event celebration, just quiet goodbyes and heavy thoughts. As Captain Ibrahim Traoré prepared to leave, a reporter caught up with him and asked one final question. "Mr. President, what do you want the world to take from today?" He smiled gently, looked up at the evening sky, and said, "Judge no one by how they enter a room. Judge them by how they leave it." That was it. No headline could say it better. He walked away without security, still in the same modest clothes. But this time, the crowd didn't ignore him. They watched, they wept, and they learned. One day, one room, one man dressed like everyone else, but who acted like no one else. That's how Captain Ibrahim Traoré reminded the world of something priceless: respect. If this story moved your heart, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more true stories that uplift and humble, and leave a comment below sharing what this moment meant to you. These stories are not made to shock, they're made to heal.